Hi everyone. I'm Jordan. I'm doing the round 7 of Australs 2025 motions breakdown. So I'm just going to go through the different motions in case anybody doesn't have access to the tab. The first one is that India should aggressively pursue the development of special economic zones, with special economic zones being a geographically designated area within a country that operates under reduced economic regulations. These include tax incentives, lower tariff rates, and special customs procedures. Second motion is that we believe artificial intelligence will do more harm than good to the average person. And the third motion is that it is in the interests of the Asian tigers to aggressively crack down on unpaid overtime. Uh, the AWGCOR of this competition also gave the participants a strictly verbal info slide, so it's not on the tab. And that's just to define that Asian tigers are Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, just in case anybody is wondering about how that was defined. So, in terms of the order, I would lean towards on the affirmative side, first preferencing the top motion, second preferencing the middle motion, and third preferencing the bottom. On the negative, I would do the reverse. So, let's go through why I think that that's the correct order. What I would note about the bottom motion is that, and this is obviously a bit of a personal preference, but I'm not a massive fan of doing debates from the affirmative where the question of your ability to actually pull off what it is that you're trying to do is really, really in question. And I think that's the case here. So, unpaid overtime is a pretty core feature of the working culture of these countries. And it's very much expected that people do that in order to advance. And it's quite universal across both white collar and I think also fairly blue collar work as well. What I would note about that is that I think it's really challenging for side affirmative to prove that this crackdown is likely to be successful. I think it's also pretty difficult for side affirmative to get many of their benefits unless it is quite broadly successful as well. So I think there are some things that side affirmative can do here in order to prove that they get success. The first thing I think is being quite precise about their setup and how they would go about doing this. And there's, I think, some kind of easy, clever stuff you can say here. So, for instance, one of the things that you might do if you're the enforcement agency here, whether that's the police or maybe a labor union or something else, or a board of labor, is you can look at things like the electricity consumption and usage in different office buildings, or in particular in things like factories where they use a lot of electricity. And you can notice, for instance, are they running really, really late, especially with offices where you tend not to have, for example, a night shift. You can then compare that against payroll data that you might be able to access, depending on how willing the government is to cooperate. But I think given that this is an aggressive crackdown, they would be very willing to share that data with you. And you can see things like, for example, it looks like in this office building, the lights are on all the time, but none of the workers are getting any overtime paid to them. That's really interesting. Maybe we should investigate here. You could also, I think, do things like say that when an office or when a business is caught for this, you might, as part of the resolution of that first penalty, do things like install CCTV in order to actually monitor whether people are working overtime or whether they're not. Or you might have things like union reps or other government reps in that workplace coming and doing random audits to see if people are working overtime and if they're being paid for that. So I think that you can do this in a relatively efficient manner if you're able to be quite precise about how you would do it. If this is more set up as something like we would have an anonymous hotline, for instance, which I think is part of the affirmative model, but just shouldn't be most of it, that I think is unlikely to be very successful because it's easy, I think, for negative to note that most people would never ever call in. The consequences are likely to be very bad. You'd lose your job if you're found out. You'd probably be blacklisted from getting other similar jobs. And I think that it's then easy to explain why workers would not ever want to voluntarily report this. So I think you have to do a lot on affirmative to explain how you'd catch it without workers necessarily wanting to report it themselves. What that means is that while I think if you're able to prove that you do get big benefits, overtime that's unpaid is probably quite bad. It's often exclusionary to many people. It reduces the productivity of the workplace as a whole, both because workers tend to be more tired, but also because by being exclusionary, you get less diverse workplaces, which also tend to be generally less productive. That I think means that if you get there, the benefits are big and you're in a good position in the debate. But you, I think, have to spend so much time proving that it will work on side affirmative that it actually becomes very difficult to retain enough time to impact your benefits enough. Whereas side negative, I think, can do a lot to say it's not going to work. And while this is ongoing, it makes things a lot worse, probably heightens paranoia in the workplace, worsens the culture as a result of that. And it might mean that bosses are significantly more inclined to supervise you and to micromanage you and to worsen their hiring decisions, like not hiring women because they might perceive that women are more likely to report this because women might have things like caring responsibilities and therefore be much worse affected by expectations around overtime. And obviously, bosses can do a lot of other nasty stuff. They can still have the same expectations, but then tell you you're not allowed to do overtime so that you might feel pressured to do this from the home or from other environments where you're going to be even less productive, but you just feel like you have to get it done because otherwise you're going to lose your job, which might make that lack of productivity even worse. So that's why I wouldn't be inclined to do this from the affirmative, although I think that there's a fine affirmative case here. It's just that I think that it's not my preference to spend so much time on proving that things will work rather than just getting straight to whether they're good or bad. On the middle debate, I think that this is really, really balanced. In terms of the affirmative side, there are, I think, fairly clear things here. You can run the normal reasons why automation is bad for workers, and the average person is pretty clearly going to be somebody who's working. The second thing is that I think there's clear stuff here around why this makes culture worse. Probably creates more slop, lower quality stuff, floods the internet, makes it harder to navigate, harder for you to get good quality information. AI can be used to manipulate the media as well, or AI itself can be manipulated, which might increase the power that tech oligarchs have over our society. And lastly, obviously, there's the existential risk argument here, which is that if AI ever gets hold of the nuclear codes, I mean, God forbid, who knows what will happen. Comparing that against side negative, I think side negative has compelling alternates to all of those arguments. There are good reasons to believe that automation will be a good thing for the average person. Governments are likely to need to respond to this well because the social chaos would be too great otherwise. Doing things like implementing UBIs, or otherwise improving public benefits, making it easier for people to go to university so that they can access jobs that maybe AI isn't as able to automate out. Or if it is the case that AI automates out a lot of knowledge work, there's perfectly reasonable arguments on side negative, explaining that freeing people up to maybe do more artisanal or blue collar work or something like that, that might actually be quite pleasant, especially if you don't have to do as many hours of that work as you would normally. And especially if this can be done at a higher and higher level where you're working on more and more complex things. So I think that's all fine. The second thing is that negative, I think, can counter the stuff about slop and the manipulation of media by explaining that there are some cases where AI can make things way more accessible, for example, through translation or through simplifying complex academic papers. And I think that lastly, you can explain that AI, yes, comes with its own existential risk, but will be instrumental in preventing others. So if we're able to use AI to significantly improve our space program, maybe that will be really helpful for heading off things like rogue asteroids. Or if we can use AI to improve medical technology, that would be good. Improving things and optimizing things like green technology would help to reduce the risk of climate change. So that I think is a really fun debate and a really good one. Connecting it to the average person is the most important thing to remember here, because if you don't, then obviously you're not meeting the burden of the debate. And that's why I haven't really talked about as much things like advancement around curing rare diseases, because those are important benefits of AI, but they don't necessarily apply to the average person who is unlikely to be afflicted with those particularly rare illnesses or things of that nature. So you have to make sure that you keep bringing it back to the ordinary person, of course. Um, Let's then talk about the top debate, which is India aggressively pursuing the development of special economic zones. Um, this, I think, is a challenging debate in some respects because India already has, I think, a fair number of special economic zones, and they're fairly, they're official and approved and they function. There are also plans in place to implement more. What that means is that affirmative, I think, is able to get away at a high level with just kind of saying like, well, we've done it a bit already. And now we're able to get away with, having more of a good thing. And by comparison, I think a lot of the side negative arguments are weaker at the point where these economic zones exist at all. Those side negative arguments probably look like things like saying that if more business is conducted in areas where there are tax exemptions, it's harder for the government to collect tax, explaining that the benefits are localized to people in and around the zones and don't necessarily flow to the rest of the country, explaining that this is a form of state planning where you just designate zones and say, these ones are going to get all of the economic activity and not these ones. And that can be quite inefficient if the state gets it wrong, and it often does, especially if, for example, it is trying to do things like favor majoritarian groups or favor politically important areas or cities. And lastly, I think you can explain that these might be used in many respects to avoid creating nationwide reform. So if you can promise multinational companies, oh, don't worry, we'll create a special economic zone around the mine that you want to work in, then the company is likely to be happy with that. The comparative is that that company might instead push the government to improve its regulations to become more efficient by doing things like advocating for tax reform or advocating for simplification around regulations. And if it was successful, those would apply then to everyone, whether it's in the state or in the country as a whole. But now that kind of energy is just basically gotten rid of and it's all localized to the zone. The problem is that when some zones already exist, I think that these arguments become a lot less compelling for side negative. Let's then compare that to the benefits from side affirmative. Here, I think that you're able to essentially explain that this can be the first step towards those regulatory reforms. So you often test these things out in the special economic zone. And then if they work, that's when companies within it expand. They might want to move beyond the zone, and the government has evidence to see that these things work. So that might be a much more plausible path towards getting those forms of deregulation or other efficiency measures. And I think in the context of India, this is particularly important because there are often complex and overlapping forms of regulation, which make it very difficult for companies to operate. And also, that means that it's very difficult when you have to deal with things like corruption, because if you need to get many different approvals from many different government officials, all of those officials at each point can demand things like bribes, other forms of corruption, which makes it very difficult, I think, for businesses to operate and very difficult for them to attract investment because it's hard for them to explicitly explain both how they're going to deal with this. Because obviously, doing things like saying in your prospectus to an investor, like, oh, don't worry, we'll just bribe all of these guys, doesn't look so good and can also be a criminal offense. Like American companies, for example, can't openly do this. The second thing is that it also makes it difficult for people to be comfortable believing that the project will succeed when it is so dependent on a variety of different forms of approvals as well. What I would then additionally say for affirmative is that you can just make claims that these policies that are in the zones are good and having more of them is good. Like having less tariffs in a port, that makes sense. It's necessary. Same with special customs procedures when you have a lot of goods moving in and out. And if you didn't have special economic zones around those ports, it's difficult to imagine how they could operate effectively. You can make similar claims about mines, which are often huge employers in regions and also extremely important. And obviously, as well, you can make the claim that India has things like a large number of rare earth minerals, particularly, I think, in the south. Those are going to be important globally for doing things like allowing the green transition to occur. So any measure there that improves the efficiency of those projects and the likelihood that they go ahead is probably quite important both for India, but also globally as well. And lastly, I think obviously pointing out that these already exist benefits side affirmative in many respects because they're able to explain that the government is used to these zones, has expertise managing them, and so is likely to create new zones in a good way, to have good oversight over them, and to prevent any harms from occurring. Like, for instance, to be reasonable about the tax concessions it provides and not overdo it such that they're missing out on revenue that they could have otherwise gotten. So that I think means then that the affirmative is fairly favorable here, and that you're able to do quite a bit around these things. Um, in the current moment in particular, I think that there's a quite strong intuition that barriers to trade and tariffs are bad. So affirmative being able to immediately just point to the benefit of, well, we have these zones, which mean that you don't have those issues in these areas. And it would be better to have more areas where you didn't have quite such a high level of tariffs. That I think is a fairly clear and easy benefit for affirmative. It's difficult to imagine how side negative could respond to that. So that's how I saw the motions and why I have the order that I do. I think overall this is a balanced set though, and I think other orders are entirely reasonable. And like I said, part of the reason why I wanted to veto the bottom one is more a personal preference and something that's related to how I prefer to approach debating. So I can see why a person might instead feel quite comfortable, for instance, proving the efficacy of that motion, and then believe that they're able to do quite a good job on the affirmative there too. All in all, I think this is good set, and I hope everyone enjoyed debating these motions. Thanks.